My mother turned my Christmas dinner into a public ranking with one polished smile and a raised wineglass. She praised my sister's beautiful new house, called it proof of a real life, and then looked straight at me like I was the unfinished version still waiting to become acceptable. The whole table laughed the way people do when they think they are watching a harmless family joke, instead of a ritual humiliation they have seen so many times it feels normal. Audrey leaned back in her chair across from me, one hand draped over her stemware, wearing that small, satisfied smirk she had perfected years ago. "Yeah," she said, stretching the word out just enough to make it sting. "When are you going to stop drifting and start building a real life?" I remember putting my fork down with ridiculous care, because when you grow up around people who enjoy testing your dignity, you learn to control the tiny movements first. Then I smiled. Not the embarrassed smile they expected, not the apologetic one I had worn through half my 20s. A calm one. "I already did," I said. "I just didn't invite anyone who doubts me." Audrey's face stalled. My mother blinked, and in that silence, something shifted for me so cleanly it almost felt physical. For the first time in my life, I was not the one being measured at that table. To understand why that line hit so hard, you have to understand the role I had been assigned in my family long before that Christmas. In my mother Caroline's version of reality, Audrey was the daughter who made sense. She had the polished job title, the curated relationship, the social media life full of flattering angles and tidy milestones, and now a house with a front door my mother could point at, like proof she had raised at least one daughter correctly. I was the daughter who required explanation, and my mother hated explanation. She hated anything that could not be summarised in one efficient sentence over brunch, after church, or during a call with relatives she secretly competed with. So she simplified me until I sounded unserious. She said I worked with old furniture, as if I spent my days dusting antique cabinets, instead of restoring estate pieces, consulting on historic interiors, and running a specialised business that people booked months ahead. She said I liked a quiet life, which was her way of translating discipline into social deficiency. She said I was still finding myself long after I had built a real client base, hired part-time help during my busiest seasons, and started making more money than anyone in the family expected from me. The truth was a lot less convenient for her. I did not drift into my work. I built it the hard way, with early mornings in workshops, years of underpricing myself before I learned not to, and a long education in the kind of expertise people only respect after they see the finished piece. I learned wood grain, veneer repair, structural restoration, custom stain work, historic hardware, and how to tell when something only looked ruined versus when it actually was. I learned how wealthy clients will smile at a woman working with her hands and still assume she should be grateful to be underpaid. I learned how to hold my ground anyway. There is a specific kind of arrogance people bring to trades they do not understand. I met it often. I beat it often too. But none of that impressed my mother the way a neat milestone did. Audrey understood that early. She had a talent I never wanted, but I could not deny she had it. She knew how to turn ordinary life events into family theatre. A promotion became a dinner. A dating anniversary became a weekend everybody had to hear about. A couch delivery became evidence that she and her boyfriend were building something meaningful. She was fluent in the exact language my mother loved most. Visible achievement packaged for admiration. And because Audrey knew it worked, she used it on me, with that elegant little cruelty that is hard to call out without sounding oversensitive. If I missed a holiday because of a commission deadline, she would laugh and say, "Leah's too free-spirited for schedules." If I showed up tired after finishing a restoration, she would say, "That self-employed life seems so stressful. I could never live with that uncertainty." If someone complimented my work, she would smile and add, "Leah's always been creative. We just keep hoping she turns it into something more permanent." She made me sound like an unfinished idea. My mother made me sound like a concern. Together, they built a version of me the rest of the family accepted because I got tired of correcting it. There is a kind of exhaustion that comes from having to introduce yourself twice, once as you are, and once again after your family has summarized you badly.
After a while, silence starts to feel more dignified than constant self-defense. But silence has a cost. If you stay quiet long enough, some people start mistaking your restraint for agreement. By that Christmas, my mother thought she was comparing her two daughters. What she did not know was that 6 months earlier, while she was still narrating me as unsettled, I had already done the most grounded thing I had ever done in my life. 6 months earlier, I bought an old boarding house on the coast of Maine. Not because it made clean sense on paper, and definitely not because it would photograph well enough for my mother to brag about before dessert. I bought it because the second I walked through the front door, I knew it belonged to the architecture of who I was. The place was weather-beaten, salt-stained, and full of the kind of expensive problems that scare off people who only like houses once they already look finished. The porch sagged in 2 places. The upstairs hallway smelled faintly of cedar and sea air. Half the windows rattled when the wind came in off the water, and several of the rooms looked like they had been abandoned mid-thought. I loved it immediately. I did not see decay. I saw shape. I saw a real workshop on the first floor with room for restoration projects, custom builds, and storage I had never been able to afford in one place before. I saw a small apartment upstairs with morning light in the kitchen, and just enough distance from the road to feel like my life had finally stopped asking permission to exist. What mattered most about that house was not that I owned it. It was that I understood it. I knew what was cosmetic, what was structural, what could wait, and what had to be done before the first hard winter. I knew how to read damage without panicking. That is one of the gifts my work gave me. Other people looked at age and saw burden. I looked at it and saw sequence. First the roofline, then the stair supports, then the windows, then the downstairs flooring. I turned the former dining room into a work table space, mapped out future guest rooms upstairs, and started building the kind of life I had wanted for years without having the language to defend it to anyone else. I was not just buying a place to live. I was creating a home, a studio, and eventually a retreat space for other makers who needed quiet, time, and a room that did not feel like it was asking them to perform being creative. It was the most settled I had ever felt, which is probably why I told almost nobody. That decision was not secrecy in the dramatic sense. It was protection. I was tired of sharing things while they were still tender enough to be talked over. My mother had a way of stepping into unfinished joy and flattening it with comparison before I even had time to enjoy it myself. Audrey was worse in a different way. She would ask questions that sounded harmless, but were designed to weaken whatever I was excited about. Did the math work long term? Was the area too seasonal? Did I worry about overcommitting to something so niche? She never asked those things when I was privately unsure. She asked them right after someone praised me, right after a moment landed in my direction for too long. Once you notice that pattern, you stop handing people fresh parts of your life to test for softness. So I kept the boarding house to myself. By Christmas, the roof repairs were done, the staircase was safe, the workshop was operational, and the upstairs apartment finally felt inhabited instead of improvised. I had repaired cracked trim, refinished doors, replaced locks, and stood in my kitchen one freezing morning,
realizing I had never felt more certain of anything in my life. The only person in my family who knew was my grandmother, Eleanor. She came up in September, a week after I closed, because I wanted one person to see it before the rest of the world got a chance to name it badly. I picked her up from the train station and drove her north, nervous in a way that surprised me. Not because I thought she would judge me, because I cared whether she saw what I saw. Most people would have walked into that house and immediately started listing costs, timelines, and everything that was wrong with it. Eleanor stood in the foyer, looked at the cracked trim, the broad staircase, the old pegs on the wall where coats must have hung decades ago, and smiled like she was being introduced to someone with character. "This place has survived," she said. "I like that about it." Then she turned to me and added, "You chose well." That meant more to me than she probably realised. She walked through every room asking real questions, not decorative ones. What had to be handled first? Which rooms could wait? How much had I budgeted for surprises? Where the workshop would go? She treated my plan like something worthy of serious attention, which is still the purest form of respect I know. 3 days before Christmas, I was in the workshop, sanding the edge of a restored cabinet door, when Eleanor called and asked if I was coming home. I told her I had not decided yet, and she was quiet for a second before saying the one thing I needed to hear. "If you go, don't go there to be judged. Go already knowing who you are." That landed hard, because family gatherings had always had a way of rearranging me. I could drive in feeling competent and leave feeling vaguely unfinished, like their version of me had somehow carried more authority than the facts of my own life. This time was different. I would be leaving from my own front door with my own key in my hand, from a house that already proved everything they kept pretending I had not built. By the time I headed to Connecticut for Christmas, I was not going back as the drifting daughter. I just had not told them yet. By the time I pulled into my parents' driveway, the house looked exactly the same as it always had at Christmas. Warm light in the windows, wreath centered perfectly on the door, ribbon so neat it looked measured with a ruler instead of tied by a human hand. My mother opened the door before I even knocked, and the bright expression she gave me lasted maybe 2 seconds before it turned managerial. "There you are," she said, stepping back. "Traffic?" Then her eyes dropped to my boots. "Honestly, Leah, you always look like you came in from repairing a dock." I was still taking off my gloves when Audrey swept in from the living room in cream cashmere and triumph. She kissed the air beside my cheek and said, "Perfect timing. Mum was just telling everyone about the closing." Of course she was. Julia passed behind her carrying a tray and muttered, "It's already unbearable," without breaking stride, which told me the night had already found its centre. The old machinery of the family was in motion before I even sat down. My father hugged me in that distracted way he always had, like he hoped affection could count as neutrality. My grandmother was seated near the fire, wrapped in dark wool, and when I looked at her, she gave me one long, steady glance and the smallest nod. It said exactly what her phone call had said a few days earlier. Don't shrink. That mattered, because shrinking had once been my entire holiday survival strategy. Smile, deflect, let the moment pass, drive home later and tell yourself it wasn't worth fighting over. But this time I had driven in with a house key in my coat pocket and the memory of dawn light in my own kitchen. I did not feel defensive. I felt anchored. Dinner started with the usual choreography. Candles lit, silver out, linen folded into those little shapes my mother thought made everything feel meaningful. But the real centerpiece was not the food. It was Audrey's house. Every conversation found its way back to it. The front hall, the natural light, the yard, the hardwood floors, the guest room, the neighbourhood, the future of it all. Audrey talked about the place like she had personally rescued it from ruin and given it purpose with her superior taste. My mother encouraged every detail with this polished, glowing reverence that might have sounded sweet to an outsider. In our family, it was orchestration. She was building the moment carefully, adding layers, inviting everyone to admire the correct daughter in the correct way. Then, once we were all seated and plates had been passed around, she lifted her wine glass.
"I just want to say how proud I am," she said, smiling at Audrey with the softness she reserved for milestones that reflected well on her. Watching Audrey buy her first house has been such a comfort to me. There's something deeply reassuring about seeing one of your daughters truly settled. A few people murmured approval. My father nodded in that tired, passive way he used when he wanted the room calm more than fair. Julia stared at her plate. My cousin raised her eyebrows at me for half a second, just enough to say, "Yes, I heard that too." Audrey gave a modest little laugh and said, "Mum, stop," in the tone that always meant, "Please continue." So my mother did. She spoke about responsibility, commitment, vision, all the words she liked to attach to visible choices with good curb appeal. Then she turned to me with that expression she used when she wanted an audience to believe she was being gentle. "Your sister just bought a beautiful house," she said. "A real house. Isn't that wonderful? Maybe next Christmas you'll finally be ready to settle down too." The laugh around the table came exactly when she expected it to. Not cruel enough to be condemned, just easy and automatic. The kind that lets a family pretend it witnessed teasing instead of hierarchy. Audrey leaned back and added her part right on cue. "Yeah," she said. "When are you going to stop drifting and start building a real life?" That was the line. Not because it was the worst thing anyone had ever said to me, but because it carried years of framing inside it. It was my mother's version of me and Audrey's version of me and every holiday translation they had ever offered, all compressed into one polished little insult they thought I would swallow. I set my fork down carefully, adjusted my napkin once, and let the silence stretch just long enough to make everyone look up. Then I smiled. "I already did," I said. "I just didn't invite anyone who doubts me." Audrey's face froze first. My mother blinked like I had skipped to the wrong page of a script she thought she knew by heart. "What?" she asked. I kept my voice calm. I already settled down. 6 months ago, I bought an old boarding house on the coast of Maine. I live there. I work there. I've been restoring it room by room. It's my home, my studio, and the foundation of the next stage of my business. The whole room changed shape after I said it. You could feel people recalculating me in real time. Not because I had suddenly become someone else, but because the version of me they had been handed for years no longer matched the facts sitting in front of them. My mother was the first to recover, which did not surprise me. Caroline always moved fastest when control slipped. She smiled in that brittle, overmanaged way and said, "A boarding house, Leah? Well, that sounds like one of your projects." Then she added, "How lovely," in the tone people use when they want to pat something on the head before it gets ideas above itself. Audrey jumped in right behind her. "Come on," she said with a laugh that had too much edge in it now. "That's not really the same thing. I bought a home. You bought some giant fixer-upper by the ocean." I looked at her and realised she still thought this was about property type, about what counted on paper, about whether the thing I'd built could be translated into the narrow language she and my mother trusted. "No," I said. "It's not the same. You bought a house everyone can understand in one glance.
I bought a life that fits me. Those are very different things. That landed harder than either of them expected. Julia stopped pretending to eat. My cousin lowered her fork. Even my father looked up with the expression of a man who had just realised silence was no longer going to do the work for him. My mother tried another angle, softer in tone but sharper underneath. She said she only wished I had shared this with the family because families were supposed to tell each other important things. It was polished enough that, in another room, it might have sounded reasonable. In ours, it sounded exactly like what it was. She wasn't hurt that I had kept something private. She was offended that something significant had happened without passing through her first, without her getting to frame it, compare it, or attach herself to it publicly. Families are also supposed to listen without reducing everything to a ranking system, I said. Audrey gave a little scoff and said I was making this into some bigger issue because I couldn't just be happy for her. I am happy for you, I told her. I'm just not willing to keep being used as the contrast that makes you feel more complete. That was the point where the room stopped pretending this was a misunderstanding. Julia set her glass down and spoke before my mother could smooth it over again. She said this had been going on for years, that every time I did something real, it got translated into something vague, and every time Audrey did something conventional, it got treated like proof of character. My mother turned to her fast and sharp, but Julia didn't back down. That shook Audrey more than my reveal had. She was used to me pushing back quietly if I pushed at all. She wasn't used to anyone else stepping in. Then my grandmother spoke, and once Eleanor spoke, the room had no place left to hide. She said I was right, that my mother had spent years talking about me as if I were unfinished, simply because my life didn't flatter her imagination. She said Audrey had been allowed to turn my supposed instability into part of her own identity, and that none of this had started tonight. My father rubbed a hand over his face and muttered something about assumptions, which was such a weak word for it that Julia actually laughed. My mother's eyes filled, but I knew her too well to mistake tears for surrender. I've done everything for this family, she said, and now I'm being made the villain because I'm proud of one daughter. I looked at her and said quietly, You're not being confronted because you're proud. You're being confronted because your pride always comes with a hierarchy. After that, dinner didn't end so much as come apart. My father made one half-hearted attempt to redirect everyone toward pie and coffee, but nobody really followed him. Audrey went still in that cold, upright way she does when she realizes charm has failed her, and all she has left is injured superiority. My cousin asked me practical questions about the property, and for the first time in years, people at that table were speaking to me directly instead of through my mother's interpretation. My grandmother asked me if I was happy there, and that question cut through the whole room more cleanly than any argument had. Because it had nothing to do with status. It had nothing to do with whether my life photographed well or fit in one sentence or looked more grown up than Audrey's. It went straight to the thing they had ignored for years. Did my life actually belong to me? I thought about the house at dawn, the salt in the air, the workshop table under my hands, the sound of the wind against the porch, the fact that when I turned my own key in that front door, nobody inside expected me to be smaller than I was. Yes, I said, I'm very happy there. Audrey muttered that keeping it secret was still weird. I looked at her and said, maybe, but not as weird as building your confidence around someone else staying underestimated. When I went to the hallway for my coat, my mother followed exactly the way I knew she would. Caroline always preferred private discipline after public failure. The second we were out of view of the table, she dropped her voice and said, "You embarrassed your sister." I buttoned my coat slowly because I was done rushing to make her discomfort easier to manage. "No," I said. "I embarrassed the story you tell about me." She was standing too close to it. Her jaw tightened. She said family doesn't do this to each other. And I almost laughed because that line had always meant the same thing in our house. The person who names the damage is expected to be more graceful than the people causing it. Healthy family doesn't use one daughter's milestone to shame another, I said, and you don't get to call it closeness when the price is my silence. She looked at me like she was searching for the old version of me, the one who would soften, apologize, and help put the evening back together. But that woman had left long before Christmas. I opened the front door, stepped into the cold, and for once I didn't leave feeling smaller. I left feeling exact. The drive back to Maine the next morning felt nothing like the old drives home from family holidays. Usually, I spent those hours replaying every sentence, editing my tone in my head, wondering if I had been too sharp, too sensitive, too difficult, or somehow not graceful enough in the face of being diminished. This time I felt clear. Not cheerful, not triumphant in some dramatic, movie-ready way, just clean inside myself. The kind of clean that comes after you finally say the thing you should have said years ago and realise the sky did not fall. My phone buzzed before I even hit the highway. My mother had already sent a clipped message about stress, embarrassment, and how much damage I had caused by choosing Christmas dinner of all nights to make a point. There was no curiosity in it, no question about the property, no interest in my life, just reputation management in text form.
A few minutes later, Julia wrote,
"I'm sorry it took this long. I'm proud of you." Then my grandmother sent, "Next time I want tea on that porch and a full tour." That was the message that got me. Not because it was sentimental, but because it was so normal, so respectful. She was not reacting to me like I had detonated the family. She was responding like I had simply told the truth, and now there was a house she wanted to see.
Over the next few weeks, the story spread through the family, the way these things always do, once somebody breaks a long pattern in public. Aunts called, cousins texted. Some people clearly wanted gossip dressed up as concern, and I ignored those. Others sounded genuinely embarrassed that they had accepted my mother's version of me for so long, without ever asking what I actually did. What mattered was the shift. People stopped speaking about me through Caroline's narration and started coming to me directly. They asked about my business, about the house, about the restoration, about whether I was taking on new commissions in the spring. Audrey posted a few brittle little things online about how real confidence doesn't need attention and how some people cannot just celebrate others, which might have been funny if they were not so transparent. My mother tried twice to reframe Christmas as an unfortunate misunderstanding, as if everyone had simply been emotional and things had gotten out of hand. I never fought her on it. I just refused the rewrite. There is a power in not arguing with a false version once you have already replaced it with the truth. By spring, my grandmother came exactly as promised. She sat on the repaired porch with a blanket over her knees and a mug warming her hands, looking out toward the water like she had all the time in the world. Then she walked through the house room by room, taking it in without performance, without trying to turn any part of it into a symbol of herself. When we got to the workshop, she rested her hand on the long table I had restored and said, "This place feels like you. Solid, thoughtful, strong where it counts." I think that was the moment the whole thing settled in me for real. Not at Christmas,
Not when my mother went quiet for a while after realizing the old version of me no longer held. Not even when relatives started correcting themselves. It was there, in that house, hearing someone I trusted describe my life without reducing it. My relationship with my mother never went back to what it had been before. And that is not a tragedy. Some relationships only feel close because one person is constantly swallowing what hurts. Once you stop doing that, the relationship reveals its actual shape. Audrey and I became polite in a colder, cleaner way. Julia and I got closer. My father remained what he had always been, late to honesty, but not entirely unreachable once someone else forced the room open first. What changed most was me. I stopped waiting to be translated correctly by people who preferred me simplified. I stopped treating their misunderstanding like a wound that needed healing, and started seeing it for what it really was: distance, preference, limitation. Settling down is not a performance. It is not a floor plan that photographs well, not a milestone other people recognize on sight, and not a life edited for easy applause. Sometimes settling down means choosing the weather-beaten property other people dismiss because you know how to see structure underneath damage. Sometimes it means protecting your joy until it has enough roots to survive being doubted. And sometimes the most satisfying answer you will ever give is the calm one, the true one, the one spoken from such a solid place that the people who underestimated you are left staring at the collapse of their own assumptions. So if this story stayed with you, like the video, share it with someone who has ever been treated like the unfinished version in their own family. And subscribe if you want more stories like this. Then tell me in the comments, at what point would you have stopped explaining yourself to a mother like Caroline? Do you think Audrey ever really saw what she was doing? And would you have kept that house private too, or told the family early and let them react?